Magic. The very word itself conjures many different images in the human mind. Magicians, wizards, witches, they're all included. In this edition of Doc TV's monster horror documentary series, we'll be delving into the powers of the mind and beyond. The world of the dark arts and supernatural magic awaits. What is magic? Magic, sometimes spelled M-A-G-I-C-K, is the application of beliefs, rituals, or actions employed in the belief that they can manipulate natural or supernatural beings and forces. It is a category into which various beliefs and practices are sometimes considered separate from religion and science. Although connotations have varied from positive to negative throughout history, magic continues to have an important religious and medicinal role in many cultures today. Within Western culture, magic has been linked to ideas of the other, foreignness, and primitivism, indicating that it is a powerful marker of cultural difference and a non-modern phenomenon. During the late 19th and early 20th century, Western intellectuals perceived the practice of magic as a sign of a primitive mentality. They commonly attributed it to marginalized groups of people. In modern occultism and neo-pagan religions, many self-described magicians and witches regularly practice ritual magic, defining magic as a technique for changing the physical world through the force of one's will. This definition was popularized by Aleister Crowley, an influential British occultist. Since then, other religions such as Wicca and Levian Satanism and magical systems like chaos magic have adopted it. White magic has traditionally been understood as the use of magic for selfless or helpful purposes, while black magic was used for selfish, harmful, or evil purposes. Concerning the left-hand path and right-hand path dichotomy, black magic is the malicious left-hand counterpart of benevolent white magic. There is no consensus on what constitutes white, grey, or black magic. As writer and occultist Phil Hine said, like many other aspects of occultism, what is termed to be black magic depends very much on who is doing the defining. Grey magic, also called neutral magic, is magic that is not performed for specifically benevolent reasons, but is also not focused on downright hostile practices. Historians and anthropologists have distinguished between practitioners who engage in high magic and those who engage in low magic. High magic, also known as ceremonial or ritual magic, is more complex, involving lengthy and detailed rituals and sophisticated, sometimes expensive paraphernalia. Low magic, also called natural magic, is associated with peasants, folklore, and more straightforward practices such as brief spoken spells. Low magic is also closely associated with witchcraft. Anthropologist Susan Greenwood writes, "Since the Renaissance, high magic has been concerned with drawing down forces and energies from heaven and achieving unity with divinity. High magic is usually performed indoors, while witchcraft is often performed outdoors." Magical history. Renaissance humanism saw a resurgence in Hermeticism and Neoplatonic varieties of ceremonial magic. On the other hand, the Renaissance saw the rise of science in such forms as the dethronement of the Ptolemaic theory of the universe, the distinction of astronomy from astrology, and chemistry from alchemy. There was great uncertainty in distinguishing practices of superstition, occultism, and perfectly sound scholarly knowledge or pious ritual. The intellectual and spiritual tensions erupted in the early modern witch craze, further reinforced by the turmoil of the Protestant Reformation, especially in Germany, England, and Scotland. In Hasidism, the displacement of practical Kabbalah using directly magical means by conceptual and meditative trends gained much further emphasis while simultaneously instituting meditative theurgy for material blessings at the heart of its social mysticism. Hasidism internalized Kabbalah through the psychology of Dvaikut cleaving to God and cleaving to the Tzaddik Hasidic Rebbe. In Hasidic doctrine, the tzaddik channels divine spiritual and physical bounty to his followers by altering the will of God, uncovering a deeper concealed will through his dvaikut and self-nullification. Dov Berv Mezerich is concerned with distinguishing this theory of the tzaddik's will altering and deciding the divine will from a direct magical process. In the 16th century, European societies began conquering and colonizing other continents worldwide. As they did so, they applied European concepts of magic and witchcraft to practices found among the people they encountered. Usually, these European colonialists regarded the natives as primitives and savages whose belief systems were diabolical and needed to be eradicated and replaced by Christianity. Because Europeans typically viewed these non-European peoples as being morally and intellectually inferior to themselves, it was expected that such societies would be more prone to practicing magic. Women who practiced traditional rites were labeled as witches by the Europeans. In various cases, these imported European concepts and terms underwent new transformations as they merged with indigenous ideas. In West Africa, for instance, Portuguese travelers introduced the term and concept of the feitiçaria, often translated as sorcery, and the feitiço spell to the native population, where it was transformed into the concept of the fetish. Europeans later encountered these West African societies, wrongly believed that the fetish was an indigenous African term, rather than the result of earlier intercontinental encounters. Sometimes colonized populations themselves adopted these European concepts for their purposes. In the early 19th century, the newly independent Haitian government of Jean-Jacques Dessalines began to suppress the practice of voodoo, and in 1835 Haitian law codes categorized all voodoo practices as sortilege, sorcery, or witchcraft, suggesting that it was all conducted with harmful intent. In contrast, among voodoo practitioners, the performance of harmful rites was already given a separate and distinct category, known as magi. By the 19th century, European intellectuals no longer saw the practice of magic through the framework of sin, and instead regarded magical practices and beliefs as an aberrational mode of thought antithetical to the dominant cultural logic, a sign of psychological impairment and marker of racial or cultural inferiority. As educated elites in Western societies increasingly rejected the efficacy of magical practices, legal systems ceased to threaten practitioners of magical activities with punishment for the crimes of diabolism and witchcraft. Instead, they threatened them with the accusation that they were defrauding people by promising to provide things that they could not. This spread of European colonial power across the world influenced how academics would come to frame the concept of magic. In the 19th century, several scholars adopted magic's traditional negative concept. That they chose to do so was not inevitable, for they could have followed the example adopted by prominent esotericists active at the time like Helena Blavatsky. She had decided to use the term and concept of magic positively. Various writers also used the concept of magic to criticize religion by arguing that the latter still displayed many of the negative traits of the former. An example of this was the American journalist H.L. Mencken's polemical 1930 work, Treatise on the Gods. He sought to critique religion by comparing it to magic, arguing that the division between the two was misplaced. Theorists also adopted the concept of magic in the new field of psychology, where it was often used synonymously with superstition. However, the latter term proved more common in early psychological texts. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, folklorists examined rural communities across Europe in search of magical practices, which they typically understood as survivals of ancient belief systems. In the 1960s, anthropologists like Jean Favret-Sada also began looking in-depth at magic in European contexts, having previously focused on examining magic in non-Western contexts. In the 20th century, magic also proved a topic of interest to the Surrealists, an artistic movement based mainly in Europe. The surrealism André Breton, for instance, published L'Art Magique in 1957, discussing what he regarded as the links between magic and art. The scholarly application of magic as a sui generis category that can be applied to any socio-cultural context was linked with promoting modernity to both Western and non-Western audiences. The term magic has become pervasive in the popular imagination and idiom. In contemporary contexts, the word magic is sometimes used to describe a type of excitement, of wonder or sudden delight, and in such a context can be a term of high praise. Despite its historical contrast against science, scientists have also applied the term to various concepts such as magic acid, magic bullets, and magic angles. Modern Western magic has challenged widely held preconceptions about contemporary religion and spirituality. The polemical discourses about magic influenced the self-understanding of modern magicians, several of whom, such as Aleister Crowley and Julius Evola, were well versed in the academic literature on the subject. According to a scholar of religion, Henrik Bogdan, arguably the best-known emic definition of the term magic was provided by Crowley. Crowley, who favored the spelling M-A-G-I-C-K over M-A-G-I-C to distinguish it from stage illusionism, was of the view that magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Crowley's definition influenced that of subsequent magicians. Diane Fortune of the Fraternity of the Inner Light stated, "Magic is the art of changing consciousness according to will." Gerald Gardner, the founder of Gardnerian Wicca, stated that magic was attempting to cause the physically unusual, while Anton LaVey, the founder of Lovean Satanism, described magic as the change in situations or events following one's will, which would use normally accepted methods, be unchangeable. The chaos magic movement emerged during the late 20th century as an attempt to strip away the symbolic, ritualistic, theological, or otherwise ornamental aspects of other occult traditions, and distill magic down to a set of basic techniques. These modern Western concepts of magic rely on a belief in correspondences connected to an unknown occult force that permeates the universe. As noted by Hanegraaff, this operated according to a new meaning of magic, which could not have existed in earlier periods, precisely because it is elaborated in reaction to the disenchantment of the world. For many, and perhaps most, modern Western magicians, the goal of magic is deemed to be personal spiritual development. The perception of magic as a form of self-development is central to the way that magical practices have been adopted into forms of modern paganism and the New Age phenomenon. One significant development within current Western magical practices has been sex magic. This was a practice promoted in the writings of Paschal Beverly Randolph and subsequently exerted a strong interest in occultist magicians like Crowley and Theodore Roos. The adoption of the term magic by modern occultists can, in some instances, be a deliberate attempt to champion those areas of Western society that have traditionally been marginalized as a means of subverting dominant power systems. The influential American Wiccan, and author Starhawk for instance, stated that magic is another word that makes people uneasy, so I use it deliberately because the words we are comfortable with, the words that sound acceptable, rational, scientific, and intellectually correct, are comfortable precisely because they are the language of estrangement. In the present day, among some countercultural subgroups, the label is considered cool. Sorcery is a legal concept in Papua New Guinea law which differentiates between good legal magic, such as healing and fertility, and illegal black magic, held responsible for unexplained deaths. According to anthropologist Edward Evan Evans Pritchard, magic formed a rational framework of beliefs and knowledge in some cultures, like the Azand people of Africa. The historian Owen Davies stated that the word magic was beyond simple definition and had a range of meanings. Similarly, the historian Michael D. Bailey characterized magic as a deeply contested category and a very fraught label. As a category, he noted, it was profoundly unstable, given that definitions of the term have varied dramatically across time and between cultures. Scholars have engaged in extensive debates as to how to define magic, with such debates resulting in an intense dispute. Throughout such arguments, the scholarly community has failed to agree on a definition of magic, similarly to how they have been unable to agree on a definition of religion. According to a scholar of religion, Michael Stolzberg, the phenomenon of people applying the concept of magic to refer to themselves and their practices and beliefs goes as far back as late antiquity. However, even among those throughout history who have described themselves as magicians, there has been no common ground regarding what magic is. In Africa, the word magic might be understood as denoting the management of forces, which, as an activity, is not weighted morally and is accordingly a neutral activity from the start of magical practice, but by the will of the magician, is thought to become and to have an outcome which represents either good or bad evil. Ancient African culture was accustomed to the discerning difference between magic and a group of other things which are not magic. These things were medicine, divination, witchcraft, and sorcery. The opinion differs on how religion and magic are related to each other concerning the development or to which developed from which. Some think they created together from a shared origin. Some think religion developed from magic, and some magic from religion. Anthropological and sociological theories of magic generally serve to sharply demarcate certain practices from otherwise similar techniques in a given society. According to Bailey, in many cultures and across various historical periods, categories of magic often define and maintain the limits of socially and culturally acceptable actions in respect to numinous or occult entities or forces. Even more, basically, they serve to delineate arenas of appropriate belief. In this, he noted that drawing these distinctions is an exercise in power. This tendency has had repercussions for the study of magic, with academics self-censoring their research because of the effects on their careers. Randall Stiers noted that attempting to define magic represents an act of demarcation by which it is juxtaposed against other social practices and modes of knowledge, such as religion and science. The historian Karen Louise Jolly described magic as a category of exclusion, used to define an unacceptable way of thinking as either the opposite of religion or of science. Modern scholarship has produced various definitions and theories of magic. Bailey states these have typically framed magic in relation to, or more frequently in distinction from, religion and science. Since the emergence of the study of religion and the social sciences, magic has been a central theme in the theoretical literature produced by scholars operating in these academic disciplines. Magic is one of the most heavily theorized concepts in the study of religion and also played a crucial role in early theorizing within anthropology. Stiers believed it appealed strongly to social theorists because it provides a rich site for articulating and contesting the nature and boundaries of modernity. Scholars have commonly used it as a foil for the concept of religion, regarding magic as the illegitimate and effeminized sibling of religion. Others have used it as a middle ground category between religion and science. The context in which scholars framed their discussions of magic was informed by the spread of European colonial power worldwide in the modern period. These repeated attempts to define magic resonated with broader social concerns, and the pliability of the concept has allowed it to be readily adaptable as a polemical and ideological tool. The links that intellectuals made between magic and those they characterized as primitives helped to legitimize European and Euro-American imperialism and colonialism, as these Western colonialists expressed the view that those who believed in and practiced magic were unfit to govern themselves and should be managed by those who, rather than believing in magic, believed in science or Christian religion. In Bailey's words, the association of certain peoples, whether non-Europeans or poor, rural Europeans, with magics served to distance and differentiate them from those who ruled over them, and in large part to justify that rule. Scholars have offered many different definitions of magic, although, according to Hanegraaff, these can be understood as variations of a small number of heavily influential theories. An intellectualist approach. The intellectualist approach to defining magic is associated with two prominent British anthropologists, Edward Tylor and James G. Fraser. This approach viewed magic as the theoretical opposite of science and came to preoccupy much anthropological thought on the subject. This approach was situated within the evolutionary models underpinning thinking in the social sciences during the early 19th century. Herbert Spencer was the first social scientist to present magic as something that predated religion in evolutionary development. In his A System of Synthetic Philosophy, he used the term magic about sympathetic magic. Spencer regarded both magic and religion as being rooted in false speculation about the nature of objects and their relationship to other things. Tylor's understanding of magic was linked to his concept of animism. In his 1871 book, Primitive Culture, Tylor characterized magic as beliefs based on the error of mistaking ideal analogy for real analogy. In Tylor's view, primitive man, having come to associate in thought those things which he found by experience to be connected in fact, proceeded erroneously to invert this action, and to conclude that association in thought must involve a similar connection in reality. He thus attempted to discover, to foretell, and to cause events by means of processes which we can now see to have only an ideal significance. Tylor was dismissive of magic, describing it as one of the most pernicious delusions that ever vexed mankind. Tylor's views proved highly influential and helped to establish magic as a significant topic of anthropological research. Tylor's ideas were adopted and simplified by James Fraser. He used the term magic to mean sympathetic magic, describing it as a practice relying on the magician's belief that things act on each other at a distance through a secret sympathy, which he described as an invisible ether. He further divided this magic into two forms, the homeopathic imitative, mimetic, and the contagious. The former was the idea that like produces like, or that the similarity between two objects could result in one influencing the other. The latter was based on the idea that contact between two things allowed the two to continue to influence one another at a distance. Like Taylor, Fraser viewed magic negatively, describing it as the bastard sister of science, arising from one great disastrous fallacy. Where Fraser differed from Tylor was in characterizing a belief in magic as a major stage in humanity's cultural development, describing it as part of a tripartite division in which magic came first, religion came second, and eventually science came third. For Fraser, all early societies started as believers in magic, with some moving away from this and into religion. He believed that both magic and religion involved a belief in spirits, but differed in how they responded to these spirits. For Fraser, magic constrains or coerces these spirits, while religion focuses on conciliating or propitiating them. He acknowledged that their common ground resulted in a crossover of magical and religious elements in various instances. For instance, he claimed that the sacred marriage was a fertility ritual that combined elements from both worldviews. Some scholars retained the evolutionary framework used by Fraser, but changed the order of its stages. The German ethnologist Wilhelm Schmidt argued that religion, by which he meant monotheism, was the first stage of human belief, which later degenerated into both magic and polytheism. Others rejected the evolutionary framework entirely. Fraser's notion that magic had given way to religion as part of an evolutionary framework was later deconstructed by the folklorist and anthropologist Andrew Lang in his essay Magic and Religion. Lang did so by highlighting how Fraser's framework relied upon misrepresenting ethnographic accounts of beliefs and practice among Indigenous Australians to fit his concept of magic. A functionalist approach toward magic. The functionalist approach to defining magic is associated with the French sociologists Marcel Mauss and Émile Durkheim. In this approach, magic is understood as being the theoretical opposite of religion. Mauss set forth his conception of magic in a 1902 essay, A General Theory of Magic. Mauss used the term magic about any rite that is not part of an organized cult, a rite that is private, secret, mysterious, and ultimately tending towards one that is forbidden. Conversely, the associated religion with an organized cult. By saying that magic was inherently non-social, Mauss had been influenced by the traditional Christian understandings of the concept. Mauss deliberately rejected the intellectualist approach promoted by Fraser, believing that it was inappropriate to restrict the term magic to sympathetic magic, as Fraser had done. He expressed that there are not only magical rites which are not sympathetic, but neither is sympathy a prerogative of magic, since there are sympathetic practices in religion. Durkheim adopted Mauss' ideas in his 1912 book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. Durkheim believed that both magic and religion pertain to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Where he saw them as being different was in their social organization. Durkheim used the term magic to describe things that were inherently antisocial, existing in contrast to what he referred to as a church, the religious beliefs shared by a social group. In his words, there is no church of magic. Durkheim expressed that there is something inherently anti-religious about the maneuvers of the magician, and that a belief in magic does not result in binding together those who adhere to it, nor in uniting them into a group leading a common life. Durkheim's definition encounters problems in situations, such as the rites performed by Wiccans, in which acts carried out communally have been regarded by practitioners or observers as magical. Scholars have criticized the idea that magic and religion can be differentiated into separate categories. The social anthropologist Alfred Radcliffe Brown suggested that a simple dichotomy between magic and religion was unhelpful, and thus both should be subsumed under the broader category of ritual. Many later anthropologists followed his example. Nevertheless, this distinction is still often made by scholars discussing this topic. An emotionalist approach to magic. The emotionalist approach to magic is associated with the English anthropologist Robert Ranulph Marett, the Austrian Sigmund Freud, and the Polish anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski. Marett viewed magic as a response to stress. In a 1904 article, he argued that magic was a cathartic or stimulating practice designed to relieve feelings of tension. As his thought developed, he increasingly rejected the idea of a division between magic and religion. He began to use the term magico-religious to describe the early development of both. Malinowski similarly understood magic to Marett, tackling the issue in a 1925 article. He rejected Fraser's evolutionary hypothesis that magic was followed by religion and then science as a series of distinct stages in societal development, arguing that all three were present in each society. In his view, both magic and religion arise and function in situations of emotional stress, whereas religion is primarily expressive and magic is predominantly practical. He therefore defined magic as a practical art consisting of acts which are only means to a definite end expected to follow later on. For Malinowski, magical acts were to be carried out for a specific end, whereas religious ones were ends in themselves. He, for instance, believed that fertility rituals were magical because they were carried out to meet a specific need. As part of his functionalist approach, Malinowski saw magic not as irrational, but as something that served a proper function, being sensible within the given social and environmental context. The term magic was used liberally by Freud. He also saw magic emerging from human emotion, but interpreted it differently from merit. Freud explains that the associated theory of magic merely explains the paths along which magic proceeds. It does not explain its true essence, namely the misunderstanding which leads it to replace the laws of nature by psychological ones. Freud emphasizes that what led primitive men to come up with magic is the power of wishes. His wishes are accompanied by a motor impulse, the will, which is later destined to alter the whole face of the earth to satisfy his wishes. This motor impulse is at first employed to give a representation of the satisfying situation in such a way that it becomes possible to experience the satisfaction through what might be described as motor hallucinations. This kind of representation of a satisfied wish is quite comparable to children's play, which succeeds their earlier purely sensory technique of satisfaction. As time goes on, the psychological accent shifts from the motives for the magical act onto the measures by which it is carried out, that is, onto the act itself. It thus appears as though it is the magical act itself which, owing to its similarity with the desired result, alone determines the occurrence of that result. In the early 1960s, the anthropologists Murray and Rosalie Wax put forward the argument that scholars should look at the magical worldview of a given society on its terms, rather than trying to rationalize it in terms of Western ideas about scientific knowledge. Other anthropologists heavily criticized their opinions and argued that they had created a false dichotomy between non-magical Western and magical non-Western worldviews. The concept of the magical worldview nevertheless gained widespread use in history, folkloristics, philosophy, cultural theory, and psychology. Various psychologists have also utilized the notion of magical thinking. In the 1920s, the psychologist Jean Piaget used the concept to argue that children could not differentiate between the mental and the physical. According to this perspective, children begin to abandon their magical thinking between the ages of 6 and 9. According to Stanley Tambia, magic, science, and religion all have their own quality of rationality and have been influenced by politics and ideology. As opposed to religion, Tambia suggests that humanity has much more personal control over events. Science, according to Tambia, is a system of behavior by which man acquires mastery of the environment. The magic-religion-science triangle developed in European society based on evolutionary ideas such as that magic evolved into religion, which evolved into science. However, using a Western analytical tool when discussing non-Western cultures or pre-modern forms of Western society raises problems, as it may impose Western alien categories on them. While magic remains an emic insider term in the history of Western societies, it remains an etic outsider term when applied to non-Western cultures and even within specific Western societies. For this reason, academics like Michael D. Bailey suggests abandoning the term altogether as an academic category. During the 20th century, many scholars focusing on Asian and African societies rejected the term magic and related concepts like witchcraft in favor of the more precise terms and concepts that existed within these specific societies like juju. Many scholars studying pre-modern societies in Europe have taken a similar approach, such as classical antiquity, who find the modern concept of magic inappropriate and favor more specific terms originating within the framework of the ancient cultures they are studying. Alternatively, this term implies that all categories of magic are ethnocentric, and that such Western preconceptions are an unavoidable component of scholarly research. This century has seen a trend towards emic ethnographic studies by scholar practitioners that explicitly explore the emic or etic divide. Many scholars have argued that using the term as an analytical tool within academic scholarship should be rejected altogether. The scholar of religion Jonathan Z. Smith, for example, argued that it had no utility as an etic term that scholars should use. The historian of religion Wouter Hanegraaff agreed because its use is founded in conceptions of Western superiority and has served as a scientific justification for converting non-European peoples from benighted superstitions, stating that the term magic is an important object of historical research, but not intended for doing research. Bailey noted that, as of the early 21st century, few scholars sought grand definitions of magic, but instead focused with careful attention to particular contexts, examining what a term like magic meant to a given society. This approach, he noted, called into question the legitimacy of magic as a universal category. The scholars of religion Bernd Christian Otto and Michael Storsberg suggested that it would be perfectly possible for scholars to talk about amulets, curses, healing procedures, and other cultural practices often regarded as magical in Western culture without any recourse to the concept of magic itself. The idea that magic should be rejected as an analytic term developed in anthropology before moving into classical and biblical studies in the 1980s. Since the 1990s, the term's usage among scholars of religion has declined. Witchcraft. The historian Ronald Hutton notes the presence of 4 distinct meanings of the term witchcraft in the English language. Historically, the term primarily referred to the practice of causing harm to others through supernatural or magical means. This remains, according to Hutton, the most widespread and frequent understanding of the term. Moreover, Hutton also notes 3 other definitions in current usage, to refer to anyone who conducts magical acts with benevolent or malevolent intent, for practitioners of the modern pagan religion of Wicca, or as a symbol of women resisting male authority and asserting an independent female authority. Belief in witchcraft is often present within societies and groups whose cultural framework includes a magical worldview. Those regarded as magicians have often faced suspicion from other members of their society. This is particularly the case if these perceived magicians have been associated with social groups already considered morally suspect in a particular society, such as foreigners, women, or the lower classes. In contrast to these negative associations, many practitioners of activities that have been labeled magical have emphasized that their actions are benevolent and beneficial. This conflicted with the standard Christian view that all activities categorized as being forms of magic were intrinsically evil regardless of the magician's intent. All magical actions relied on the aid of demons. There could be conflicting attitudes regarding the practices of a magician. In European history, authorities often believed that cunning folk and traditional healers were harmful. After all, their methods were regarded as magical and thus stemming from contact with demons. In contrast, a local community might value and respect these individuals because their skills and services were beneficial. In Western societies, the practice of magic was usually associated with women, especially when harmful. For instance, around 3/4 of those executed as witches were female during the witch trials of the early modern period, while only 1/4 were men. Women were more likely to be accused and convicted of witchcraft in this period because their position was more legally vulnerable, with women having little or no legal standing independent of their male relatives. The conceptual link between women and magic in Western culture may be because many of the activities regarded as magical, from rites to encourage fertility to potions to induce abortions, were associated with the female sphere. It might also be connected to the fact that many cultures portrayed women as inferior to men on an intellectual, moral, spiritual, and physical level. Magicians. Anyone can perform many of the practices which have been labeled magic. For instance, some charms can be recited by individuals with no specialist knowledge or claim to having a specific power. Others require specialized training to perform them. Some of the individuals who performed magical acts on a more than occasional basis came to be identified as magicians or with related concepts like sorcerers and sorceresses, witches, or cunning folk. Identities as a magician can stem from an individual's claims about themselves, or it can be a label placed upon them by others. In the latter case, an individual could embrace such a label, or they could reject it, sometimes vehemently. There can be economic incentives that encourage individuals to identify as magicians. In the cases of various forms of traditional healers, as well as the later stage magicians or illusionists, the label of magician could become a job description. Others claim such an identity out of a genuinely held belief that they have specific unusual powers or talents. Different societies have different social regulations regarding who can take on such a role. For instance, it may be a question of familial heredity, or there may be gender restrictions on who is allowed to engage in such practices. A variety of personal traits may be credited with giving magical power, and frequently they are associated with an unusual birth into the world. For instance, in Hungary, it was believed that a Teltos would be born with teeth or an additional finger. In various parts of Europe, it was thought that being born with a caul would associate the child with supernatural abilities. In some cases, a ritual initiation is required before becoming a specialist in such practices. In others, an individual is expected to receive mentorship from another specialist. Davies noted that it was possible to crudely divide magic specialists into religious and lay categories. He said, for instance, that Roman Catholic priests, with their rites of exorcism and access to holy water and blessed herbs, could be conceived as being magical practitioners. Traditionally, initiation is the most common method of identifying, differentiating, and establishing magical practitioners from ordinary people. Through rites, the magician's relationship to the supernatural and his entry into a closed professional class is often found through rituals that simulate death and rebirth into a new life. However, since the rise of neo-paganism, Berger and Ezzy explain that as there is no central bureaucracy or dogma to determine authenticity, an individual's self-determination as a witch, Wiccan, pagan or neopagan is usually taken at face value. Ezzy argues that practitioners' worldviews have been neglected in many sociological and anthropological studies, and that this is because of a culturally narrow understanding of science that devalues magical beliefs. Mauss argues that the powers of specialists and common magicians are determined by culturally accepted standards of the sources and the breadth of magic. A magician cannot simply invent or claim new magic. In practice, the magician is only as powerful as his peers believe him to be. Throughout recorded history, magicians have often faced skepticism regarding their purported powers and abilities. For instance, in 16th century England, the writer Reginald Scott wrote The Discovery of Witchcraft, arguing that many of those accused of witchcraft or otherwise claiming magical capabilities were fooling people using illusionism. And there you have it, the ins and outs of supernatural magic. Do you believe in it? Are you one of the many who practice the darker arts? What's real and what's not? The search for answers continues. Join us for another episode of Doc TV's Monster Horror documentary series soon.